The wine didn't sting as much as her words. Red drops bled into the white fabric of my brand new suit, but the real stain had been there for decades. I sat frozen in my chair, the din of Christmas chatter fading into a sharp silence. My daughter's voice cut through it all, calm but lethal. You missed too many holidays. I had been absent for birthdays, graduations, even her wedding. I told myself I was building a future for her, but the truth was simpler. I was a coward who found it easier to work late than to face my own grief. 15 years ago, I stood by her mother's grave and promised, I'll always be here. The next day, I boarded a flight to Chicago for a meeting I could have postponed. That was the first crack in something I thought was unbreakable. Now, decades later, the fracture had become a canyon. I'd come tonight in my best suit, carrying a bottle of vintage wine and a gift wrapped in silver paper, something her mother once loved. But gifts don't patch decades of silence. Her eyes told me she wasn't here for reconciliation. She was here to remind me of every empty chair I'd left at every holiday table. I didn't argue. I didn't apologize. Not yet. Instead, I smiled. Because for the first time in years, I realized the conversation between us wasn't over. And I had a plan to make sure it wouldn't be. I was 50 when my wife, Claire, died in a car accident on an icy December morning. 1 minute, I was a husband and father with a home full of warmth. The next, I was a widower, staring at a half-empty bed, and a daughter who had just lost the only constant in her life. Emily was 10 at the time, small for her age, with hazel eyes that seemed too grown up for a child. At the funeral, she clung to my coat sleeve as if letting go might make me vanish too. When the service ended and the last handful of earth was thrown over Claire's coffin, I knelt beside Emily. I remember her face, streaked with tears and cold air. I told her, I'll always be here for you. I meant it, or at least I thought I did. But grief has a way of turning good intentions into empty promises. The next morning, I took a call from a longtime client. It was an emergency shipment that had to leave Chicago within 48 hours. I could have declined. I could have stayed home and cooked breakfast with Emily, tried to fill even a fraction of the hole her mother left. Instead, I booked a flight that afternoon. I told myself it was for her, to secure the money for her future, her college, her safety. But deep down, I knew I was running away from the silence of our house, from the sound of her crying at night. Weeks passed, and work became the place where my grief felt manageable. In the office, I could bury myself under contracts and numbers, and no one asked how I was holding up. At home, Emily grew quieter. She didn't stop loving me, at least not yet, but I could feel the shift. Her 10th birthday came in the spring. I was in Chicago again, sitting in a boardroom lit by fluorescent lights while a snowstorm howled outside. My phone buzzed with a reminder, Emily's birthday, 5 p.m. I looked at the time. The meeting was running late, the client was impatient, and my flight home had already been canceled. I called the house. My mother-in-law answered. She's about to blow out the candles, she said. I told her to put Emily on the phone. She came on, voice soft, saying, Hi, Dad. I promised her there was a gift coming in the mail. It was a big one, something expensive, something I thought would make up for me not being there. It's okay, she said, before I even explained. I know you're busy. Her voice was flat, the kind of flatness that doesn't come from boredom but from something breaking. 2 days later, I got a call from my mother-in-law. She didn't yell, didn't accuse. She just said, "You know she cried after hanging up with you?" She didn't want the cake. She didn't want the presents. She wanted you. Her voice softened, almost a whisper. "She's going to remember this longer than you think." That sentence lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. I told myself I'd make it up to her. I'd be at the next recital, the next holiday, the next everything. But the problem with telling yourself you'll do better next time is that there's always another meeting, another flight, another excuse. By the end of that year, I'd missed Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. For Halloween, I sent a box of store-bought candy and a witch costume she never wore. For Thanksgiving, I wired money to cover a fancy dinner I wasn't there to eat. For Christmas, I mailed a necklace I'd picked out in an airport gift shop. I convinced myself that as long as the gifts were thoughtful, she'd feel my presence. But presence isn't something you can package in a box or send through the mail. It's in the moments you show up when no one else does. It's in being there for the little things, the silly things, the boring things. And every time I chose work over home, I chipped away at something fragile between us. I noticed her laughter changed. It became rarer, quieter. Sometimes she wouldn't answer my calls at all, and when she did, it was just to tell me she had homework or was going out with friends. She never said, "I miss you." That was when I realized she'd stopped expecting me to be around. One evening, I came home early from a trip. The house was quiet. I found a note on the fridge in Emily's handwriting. "At practice. Dinner's in the microwave. No. Love, Emily." No smiley face doodle like she used to draw. Just words, bare and functional. Standing there in that kitchen, I thought about the promise I'd made at the funeral. "I'll always be here." I'd told myself it was still true, because I was working for her, building for her. But the truth was simpler and crueler. I'd been absent in all the ways that mattered. And one day, I'd find out just how deep that absence had cut. The years blurred together, marked not by seasons or holidays, but by flight numbers and hotel receipts. I kept telling myself I was doing it for Emily. But the truth was that somewhere along the line, I'd started living a life that didn't have her in the center anymore. Every holiday I missed, I tried to compensate with something bigger, shinier, more expensive. A mountain bike for her 12th birthday, a laptop for Christmas, designer sneakers for the first day of high school. I wrapped them carefully, wrote little notes, and mailed them across the country from whatever city I happened to be in. But her responses grew shorter with each passing year. At first, I'd get a "thanks, Dad," followed by a smiley face. Then it was just "thanks." Eventually, even that was rare. Sometimes she wouldn't reply at all, and I'd call to make sure she got the package. More often than not, the calls went to voicemail. When she did pick up, it was always the same flat tone. "I'm fine. School's fine. Don't worry about me." One Christmas, I called on the morning of the 25th. I was sitting in a hotel room in Dallas, my suitcase half packed for a flight the next day. She answered, but I could hear people laughing in the background. "Where are you?" I asked. "At Mom's," she said, meaning her stepmother's house. Her mother-in-law had remarried a few years back, and I'd been relieved at first, thinking Emily would have more support. I never asked many questions about the new husband. He was just Mark in my mind. But that morning, as she passed the phone to someone else, I heard her say, "Here, Dad, talk to him." And it wasn't me she was talking to. It was him. The word hit me harder than I expected. Dad. Not Mark, not Mom's husband, but Dad. I stayed on the line, silent, while he spoke to me with forced politeness. When we hung up, I stared at the blank wall of my hotel room for a long time, realizing something had shifted. I wasn't just absent, I'd been replaced. After that, I tried harder to call, to visit, but the conversations felt strained, rehearsed, like we were both reading from a script we didn't believe in. She stopped telling me about school or friends, stopped asking me about my work. When I suggested coming to one of her soccer games, she said, "It's not a big deal. You don't have to." I told myself she was just being independent, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. One rainy afternoon, I came home earlier than expected from a business trip. I'd planned to surprise her, maybe cook dinner together like we used to. The house was quiet. I set my suitcase down and wandered into the hallway, where her bedroom door was half open. I was about to knock when I heard her voice. She was on the phone with a friend. I froze when I heard her say, "I can't even remember the last time I had Christmas with my real dad." Her tone wasn't angry. It was worse. It was indifferent. Like the thought of me being there was so far removed from reality that it barely mattered anymore. I stepped back from the door, my chest tight. She laughed at something her friend said, a light, easy laugh I hadn't heard directed at me in years. That was when I understood that the distance between us wasn't just about my calendar or my travel schedule. This was a wound, and I had been the one holding the knife without realizing it. I sat in the living room for an hour, listening to the rain drum against the windows, thinking about every time I had chosen work over her. I had told myself it was temporary, that one day we'd make up for all the missed moments. But children don't wait for you to catch up. They grow up in the gaps you leave behind. That night, she came downstairs for dinner, surprised to see me. "You're home?" she said, as if it were the most unusual thing in the world. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thought I'd surprise you." She smiled politely, sat down, and we ate in near silence. I wanted to ask her about what I'd overheard, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Some truths, once spoken, can't be taken back. As I cleared the plates, I realized I was no longer fighting to stay present in her life. I was fighting to earn my way back in, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if I'd already lost. It had been 5 years since I'd last spent Christmas with Emily. By then, our conversations had dwindled to a few obligatory calls a year. Birthdays, maybe Father's Day, if she remembered. I had learned to keep my expectations low, to measure progress in the smallest gestures. So when her text came in early December, I stared at it for a long time before I believed it was real. "If you're free, come for dinner." That was all it said. No Christmas. No I miss you. Just those 7 words. But for me, it was a crack in a door I'd thought was locked forever. I replied instantly, telling her I'd be there. The days leading up to Christmas Eve felt like a slow climb towards something I couldn't name. I spent hours in front of my closet, debating what to wear. I finally settled on a crisp white suit I'd never worn before, paired with a deep green tie. I bought a bottle of vintage wine I knew her mother had loved, and a gift wrapped in silver paper, a rare book Claire used to read aloud to Emily at bedtime. I imagined the moment I would hand it to her, how she might smile, how maybe, just maybe, it could be the start of something new. When I arrived at her house, I was greeted at the door by warm light and the smell of roasted turkey. Laughter drifted from the dining room. For a moment, I let myself believe this could be one of those holiday movie scenes where the estranged father is welcomed back into the fold. Emily met me in the hallway. She looked older, sharper around the edges, but still had the same hazel eyes. "Hi, Dad," she said. Her tone was neutral, but the word dad was something I hadn't heard from her in a long time. Dinner was already in full swing when I joined the table. There were at least 10 people: friends, relatives, neighbors. I recognized her stepfather, Mark, sitting across from me. He gave me a polite nod. Emily moved around the table, topping off glasses, laughing at someone's joke. If she looked at me at all, it was in passing. I tried to join in, but every attempt at conversation seemed to dissolve before it began. She asked Mark how work was going, complimented her friend's new scarf, teased her younger cousin about eating too much pie. To me, she offered only a quick, "Turkey's on your left." As the evening wore on, the hum of conversation grew louder, but I felt more and more like a ghost at my own daughter's table. The gift I'd brought sat on the empty chair beside me, untouched. Then came the toast. Mark stood first, raising his glass to family and the year ahead. Others followed with their own well wishes. Finally, Emily picked up her wine glass. For a fleeting second, she looked at me, and I thought I saw something soften in her expression. But it wasn't softness. She stepped toward me, her movements deliberate, and before I could process what was happening, she tipped her glass forward. A rush of cold liquid splashed across my chest, the deep red soaking into the white fabric of my suit. Gasps rose from around the table. Emily didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She just looked me dead in the eye and said, "You missed too many holidays." Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through every other sound in the room. My breath caught, not from the wine, but from the weight of those words. Words I'd been expecting, in one form or another, for years. Around us, the conversation stopped completely. Someone coughed. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I could have defended myself. I could have explained the work trips, the contracts, the money I thought I was earning for her future. But what would be the point? She already knew all that, and none of it mattered. So I just smiled. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I understood. This wasn't an attack. It was a verdict, and in some ways, it was the first truly honest thing she'd said to me in years. I took my napkin, dabbed at the spreading stain, and sat back down. The gift on the chair beside me remained unopened. The moment passed. The clinking of silverware slowly resumed, but nothing about the night felt the same. For the rest of the meal, I barely tasted the food. I kept my eyes on my plate, listening to the laughter and chatter around me, as if from a great distance. I knew then that this dinner wasn't meant to heal anything. It was meant to show me just how far apart we drifted and how much work it would take to find our way back. The wine soaked through the fabric, cooling against my skin, but I barely felt it. I looked at Emily, saw the steel in her eyes, and understood this wasn't a moment born of impulse. This was deliberate. A judgment passed after years of quiet resentment. I smiled, not because it didn't hurt, but because anger wouldn't serve me here. If I lashed out, I'd only prove the story she'd been telling herself, that I was a man who didn't care enough to stay. So I lifted the napkin, pressed it gently against my chest, and nodded once, almost as if I agreed with her. The rest of the table shifted uncomfortably. A few eyes darted between us. Mark muttered something about the turkey getting cold, and the noise of cutlery returned, hesitant at first. I sat for another 10 minutes, chewing without tasting, my thoughts already miles away. Then I placed the silver-wrapped gift on the empty chair beside me and stood. Emily didn't stop me. She didn't even look up. I buttoned my stained jacket and made my way to the door, murmuring good night to no one in particular. But I didn't go home. The night air was sharp, cutting through the lingering scent of wine on my suit. I drove across town to the cemetery, the one I hadn't visited in years. Claire's grave was easy to find, even in the dark. The stone was simple. Her name, her dates, and a line she'd loved, always in the little things. I stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into my bones. Then I set the gift down on the grave. I had bought it for Emily, but maybe it belonged here instead. It was the same book Claire used to read to her at bedtime, the corners worn from years of turning pages. I brushed the frost from the top of the stone. "I'm trying," I whispered. "I just don't know if she'll ever let me." In the weeks that followed, I stayed quiet. I didn't call Emily, didn't ask for explanations. Instead, I began something different. Every month, I wrote her a letter by hand, about memories, about her mother, about the things I wished I'd said when she was younger. I mailed them with no expectation of reply. I found old photo albums and sent them to be restored, the fading colors brought back to life. Each time one came back, I'd slip a single photograph into a new envelope and mail it to her. Sometimes it was her first day of school. Sometimes it was her and Claire in the kitchen baking cookies. I didn't include notes beyond the date and place. I wanted the pictures to speak for themselves. That December, I bought a small Christmas tree, the kind you could carry in one arm. I decorated it simply, white lights, silver ornaments, and left it on her porch the week before Christmas. No card, no signature, just a quiet reminder that I was still here. I didn't know if she kept it or threw it away. I didn't ask. Then, in late January, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. It was short, almost cryptic. "She reads every letter. She keeps the photos. She's just not ready." It took me a moment to realize it was from her stepmother. I stared at the words for a long time, a strange mix of relief and sadness settling over me. She was seeing my efforts. They weren't being ignored. They were being stored somewhere, maybe even treasured in a way she couldn't admit yet. For the first time in years, I felt something like hope. Not the kind that expects immediate change, but the kind that knows healing is slow, uneven, and sometimes invisible. I didn't need her to forgive me tomorrow. I just needed her to know I wasn't going anywhere again. It had been a year since the wine-stained suit and the silent verdict at her Christmas table. In that time, I'd sent 12 handwritten letters, a dozen restored photographs, and 2 small Christmas trees. She had never replied, not once, but I'd learned to live with that. Then, one morning in early spring, my phone buzzed. It was a picture message from Emily. No words, just an image. In it, she sat on a hospital bed, her hair pulled back, her face pale but glowing. In her arms was a newborn wrapped in a white blanket, eyes barely open. The baby's tiny fist clutched at her shirt. I stared at the picture for a long time, tracing every detail, the shape of the baby's nose, the faint shadow of Claire in the curve of Emily's smile. I didn't need a caption. I knew exactly what it meant. I was a grandfather. My chest tightened, not just with joy, but with the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this was her way of letting me back in. I typed out a dozen different replies before deleting them all. In the end, I sent just 3 words. He's beautiful, M. 2 days later, I drove to her house. I had no plan beyond showing up and telling her how happy I was for her. The house looked different. Fresh paint, new curtains in the windows. But I could still picture the little girl who used to wait for me by that front door. I knocked. Footsteps approached. Then the door opened just a crack. Emily stood there, holding the baby against her shoulder. She looked tired but strong, her eyes sharper than I remembered. Em, I said softly. I came to... She cut me off. You can't come in. I blinked, caught off guard. I wanted to see him, to meet my grandson. Her jaw tightened. You're not going to do to my son what you did to me. The words landed like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to protest, to explain that I was different now, that I was here. But the look on her face stopped me. It wasn't anger. It was fear. The kind of fear that comes from old wounds. The kind you protect by building walls too high to climb. I swallowed. I understand, I said. And I did. She shifted the baby in her arms, glanced over her shoulder, then stepped back and closed the door. I stood there for a while, listening to the muffled sounds of a child's cry on the other side. Then I turned and walked away. On the drive home, I thought about all the ways I'd imagined this moment. In none of them had I been standing outside, shut out, feeling the same emptiness I'd given her so many times before. I realized then that my problem wasn't just wanting her forgiveness too soon. It was thinking that forgiveness was something I could earn on my own schedule. If I really meant what I'd been telling myself, that I was here for the long haul, then I had to accept that the road back into her life wouldn't be straight or short. It would take years. It might take the rest of my life. A week later, I walked into a small toy shop in town. In the corner was a wooden rocking horse, hand-carved, with a smooth finish and a tiny leather saddle. I thought of my grandson, too small now to ride it, but one day big enough to climb on by himself. I bought it, but when the clerk asked if I wanted to include a card, I shook my head. No name, I said. Just deliver it to this address. It arrived on her porch 2 days later. I didn't hear from her, but I didn't expect to. I could picture it sitting in the corner of the nursery, waiting for the day she might tell him who it came from, or not. That was the point. I wasn't doing this for recognition anymore. I was doing it because I had finally learned that being present isn't about showing up once and hoping for applause. It's about staying, quietly, even when no one is watching. December came again, and with it, the familiar ache that the season always carried for me. I had long since given up expecting invitations. My traditions had become solitary, stringing up a few lights in my apartment, cooking a modest dinner, and maybe sending one last letter of the year to Emily. Then, the morning before Christmas Eve, my phone buzzed. It was her. If you're free, come for dinner tomorrow. I stared at the screen, rereading the words over and over. They were almost identical to the message she'd sent 2 years before, but this time, something felt different. There was no hesitation in my hands as I typed back, "I'll be there." That night, I barely slept. I thought about what to bring, what to wear. I decided on something simple, a navy blazer, an old scarf Claire had given me. and a bottle of the same vintage wine I'd carried to her table once before. I wasn't going to risk the white suit. When I arrived the next evening, snow was falling in soft, heavy flakes. The porch light glowed warmly against the dark, and for a moment I stood there, listening to the muffled laughter coming from inside. My heart beat fast, not from fear, but from something that felt dangerously close to hope. As I stepped inside, the first thing I saw stopped me in my tracks. Hanging on the coat rack by the door was a faded red sweater. My red sweater. I hadn't worn it in 30 years, not since Emily was a little girl who used to tug at the sleeves and bury her face in it when she was tired. It wasn't just hanging there as decoration. It was clean, mended in places where the threads had worn thin, as if someone had been taking care of it all these years. Emily appeared in the hallway, holding my grandson, now a toddling blur of energy, in her arms. She caught my gaze lingering on the sweater. "It still fits," she said quietly. We moved into the dining room. The table was set for 6, with Mark at one end and Emily at the other. I took a seat in the middle, next to my grandson's high chair. The smell of roast chicken and cinnamon filled the air. Conversation flowed easily among the others, and while Emily didn't direct many words my way, she didn't avoid me either. Halfway through dinner, she stood and picked up a bottle of wine. "More?" she asked. Her tone was casual, but when she poured into my glass, her hand lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Our eyes met, and in hers, I didn't see the cold judgment of that first Christmas dinner. I saw something softer, not forgiveness, maybe, but the beginnings of it. No one mentioned the past. There were no apologies, no explanations, just the sound of plates being passed, my grandson babbling happily, and Emily occasionally glancing at me with a look I couldn't quite name. After dessert, I put on the red sweater. It felt snugger than it used to, but warm in a way no other piece of clothing could be. Emily smiled faintly when she saw it. "Mom used to say, 'You looked ridiculous in that thing,'" she said, her voice carrying a trace of fondness. We didn't linger on it. The evening wound down, guests began to leave, and I found myself standing at the door with my coat in hand. Emily walked me out. Snow had begun to fall again, catching in her hair. "Thanks for coming," she said. It was simple, but her tone made it feel like something more. I nodded. "Thanks for having me." There was a pause, and for a moment I thought she might say something else. Instead, she reached out, touched my arm lightly, and went back inside. I stood there for a long time, the warmth of her touch still lingering through the wool of the sweater. I didn't know what would come next, whether we'd drift apart again or find our way closer. But for the first time in decades, I felt that the door between us was no longer locked, and that was enough.